So welcome to the second reflection this morning. And in the first part, we looked at kind of the emphasis in Scripture on and in the Gospel about what God has done for us. And in this second part, we're going to move on a little bit and just kind of examine what kind of response might be expected of us who have received such great mercy and such great grace in our lives. And if we go back again to this passage in Ephesians, we remember that Paul is not he doesn't just emphasize that they weren't saved by their good works, but he also tells them that they were saved for good works, that they weren't just saved from something, but they were also saved to something. They were saved to this new way of life, this new way of being human in the world. And by way of kind of analogy, in the Old Testament, you have God taking and delivering Israel from kind of slavery and servitude in Egypt, but that was kind of only half of the story. He doesn't just deliver them out of Egypt and then just leave them. The whole purpose, the whole goal from the very beginning was that they would journey out of Egypt and into the fulfillment of God's promises to them, into their inheritance in the promised land. So they weren't just saved from Egypt, they were saved into and for their inheritance as sons and daughters in the promised land. And again, this is what we looked at in the first part, that we are not just saved kind of out of darkness, but we are brought into light, that we're not just saved from death, but we are gifted life, that we are not just delivered from the power of sin, but we are gifted also with righteousness. And this becomes really important, because if our gospel is simply reduced to kind of being accepting forgiveness of sins, and that we might hope that when we actually pass away that we might go to a better place, if that's our gospel, if that's good news, and that's the kind of the narrative that's guiding our life, then there isn't really any place for there in growing in holiness or developing spiritual maturity or kind of partnering with God in any sense. But if kind of at the heart of the gospel message and after kind of the heart of the salvation story is about this kind of restoration of the kind of the divine human partnership for the sake of the world, then actually learning how to partner with God and growing in holiness and growing in spiritual maturity become essential, because from the very beginning, as we've been exploring, God is consistently looking for people who will partner with him, to join him in his mission, to bring about his kingdom upon the earth. From the very beginning, Adam and Eve were the original holy partners in the heavenly calling. Israel and Abraham kind of inherited that, and now we stand kind of in that place in and through Christ. God is continually looking for people, faithful people, people who will go on that journey of maturity, who grow in their understanding of what it means to partner with him, to see his plans and his purposes come about. And so if I'm right in this, and if kind of a major aspect of this grace is this reconciliation, this restoration of this partnership, then the question then becomes this, okay, well, what do we actually do about that? What does that actually look like? And we've established that God is the primary actor. God is the great instigator in this relationship. But it becomes clear just from kind of just digging into scriptures, you don't have to go far, because scattered kind of throughout the pages of the New Testament, you find examples that there is something kind of expected or demanded from us as a response to the mercy and to the grace that we've been shown. And there are examples where we are told to do certain things. And so the authors, Paul and Peter and John and elsewhere, saying, look, God has done this for you. God in Christ has given you this gift of mercy and of love. Now you do these things. So it says, God's done this, and so you put to death the deeds of the flesh. You put away your former way of life. You put to death whatever is in you that is earthly. You don't be conformed to the kind of the patterns and the ways of this world. You be renewed in the kind of the spirit of your minds. You clothe yourself with the new self. You put on the whole armor of God. You seek the things that are above. You fight the good fight. And so just going through, and these are just kind of a short list, a short example of some of the things, but we're told to put things to death, to seek things, to clothe ourselves, to put on the armor of God, these active things that we are called to do in response to the mercy of God. And so if that's true, kind of we have this response and there are things that we have to do in response, and we're expected to do in response to it, then how do we kind of stop these new expectations on us from simply becoming a new form of trying to earn God's favor and blessing through our good works? How do we not just kind of find ourselves lapsing into a form of legalism and moralism? And to answer that, or to begin to answer that, I want to draw attention to something that a guy named Richard Foster. It's a picture, it's an image that Richard Foster uses to describe the journey towards maturity, or a description of what it means to partner with God in a healthy way. And some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but he says this. He says, imagine that you are on a mountain ridge. You are walking along this mountain ridge, and on your left-hand side is this kind of sheer drop-off, and on the right-hand side is this sheer drop-off. And each of these two sides, these drop-offs, represent two kind of ends or two major errors that we can make in our journey together with God. And said, on the one hand is this sense in which our growth and our maturity and our holiness is completely dependent upon our moral effort, our straining and our striving. And so if I just read my Bible more, if I just prayed more, if I just fasted for an extra day or an extra week or whatever it is, then I would become more like Christ. And if you fall, kind of slip down that side of the mountain, you slip into legalism, kind of works righteousness. You become a bit more like, some would say, the kind of the Pharisees, as it were. But he says on the other side of the mountain is this other extreme, and this is the idea that we have no role to play whatsoever, and it's all up to God. That somehow we'll just go to bed one night, we'll wake up in the morning, and all of a sudden I'm spiritually mature, I've grown in holiness, and I have this incredible relationship with God, and it just happened, and it was just a miracle, and I had nothing to do with it. It was almost against my will. And the result of falling down this side of the mountain is kind of a laziness or an apathy that oftentimes ends up in kind of sin and back in immorality. And between these two extremes, Richard Foster says there's this path, and he calls this path the path of disciplined grace. The path of disciplined grace. And this is the path of journeying with God, of partnering with God, and it's where the divine human partnership interacts in a healthy way. And he says it's disciplined because we do have a role to play. We have to engage our choices and our will in this relationship, but it's also grace because it's freely given to us, and it's where God's grace meets us. God's grace meets us in our discipline. It's where the human partnership is established. And as I was kind of thinking about today, and thinking about kind of scriptures to look at and resources and what the Bible actually says about this, I came across this incredible passage in Paul's letter to Titus in chapter 2. And he says this. It says that the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all, training us to renounce impiety and worldly passions. And he says, and in the present age to live lives that are self-controlled, upright and godly. I don't know if you caught this. He says the grace of God has appeared to train us to renounce the former way of life and to live lives that are self-controlled, upright and godly. God's grace does not give us a license or an excuse to live however we want. But God's grace is there to train us. It's there to guide us, to educate us, to lead us into maturity, to live lives that are self-controlled, godly, and upright. And this is an incredible thing, because no longer is kind of our grace and works opposed to each other, but you see them in the kind of the progression that they should be. That grace appears first, and it leads us into lives that are self-controlled, disciplined and godly. He goes on to say that God gave himself for us, again, to redeem us from the former way of life, from all iniquity, to purify for himself a people of his own who are zealous for good deeds. Jesus gave himself to redeem us from iniquity, kind of taking us to redeem us, to take us out of Egypt, and to purify for himself a people of his own who are zealous for good deeds or good works. The people of God who have experienced the love and the mercy of God should be marked by a zeal for good works. Twice later in chapter 3, he talks about that believers should be devoting themselves to good works. Elsewhere in his letters to Timothy and to the Corinthians, he says that we are to train ourselves in godliness. And he gives the example of an athlete. And he says, look, you see these athletes and they're living disciplined, self-controlled lives in order that they can compete in games and maybe one day win this kind of perishable prize. But he goes on to say, how much more then should we, who are kind of in line for this imperishable, everlasting, eternal, glorious prize, how much more should we then live lives that are disciplined and self-controlled? We should be kind of going into spiritual training ourselves in godliness. And I'm going to leave it there, but I'm going to leave us again with a few questions on the back of that. And so, first one is, what do you think about Richard Foster's analogy about this kind of path of disciplined grace? Which side of the mountain are you more likely to fall down on? The side of kind of your own effort and legalism, or kind of it's all up to God and laziness and apathy? Secondly, what do you think about the idea of training in godliness, and what would that actually look like practically? And then lastly, if we take on board this idea that we are called into a life of kind of discipline and intention and growing in godliness, how do we stop that from becoming, again, slipping into trying to earn God's favor and God's blessing in our lives? What can we do to prevent that? And so we're going to do another breakout again, discuss these in the groups, and then we'll come back together, and I'd love to hear what you come up with.